Globalization masks the differences that cultures provide. Because it's masked, we tend to think that it's no longer there.
How do I understand this culture that I'm now working with?
India, for example, the manager is expected in Indian culture for a variety of different reasons to have expertise. The American management style often is to default decision-making to the team, and that if they need help, they'll turn to their manager and ask or make suggestions even as to what needs to be done. Think of Japan, for example, where we have the saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. That's the complicated mix of managing culture today. But at the end of the day, it's still what it was 2,500 years ago in many, many ways.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. If you lead a team today, I'm going to bet that there's a high probability you have team members that live in different countries. And that means a different culture, a different language, different traditions, and probably different expectations about what you should be doing for them as a manager. And it's a challenge. Frequently, you have no time to go and visit them. Frequently, there is a little way to bring the team together. But you need to figure out how to be effective in a very different culture. So what do you need to know? What do you watch out for? What are the things that you should track? And more importantly, how do you build trust across those borders? Now, my conversation today is going to include Dean Foster, and Dean may be uniquely qualified to address this question, because he has worked with most of the major Fortune 500 companies, national governments, and NGOs like the United Nations and the World Trade Institutes, among others. He's worked in over 100 cultures personally. He's a guest lecturer at a whole bunch of institutions like Harvard Business School, Columbia, Darden in the U.S. as well, NYU, to name a few. He's the host of CNN's nationwide, quote, Doing Business in, ... series, a frequent guest commentator, all sorts of places like CNN, CNBC, BBC, and a whole bunch of other places, Newsweek, USA Today, New York Times, just list the list. I think he's been there somewhere. And he has an irreverent podcast called Oops, Your Culture is Showing. The book we're talking about today is Business Beyond Borders, Stories, Tales, and Lessons Learned from Working in over 100 countries around the world. Dean, it's a delight to have you.
Wanda, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we can have this chat.
I am looking forward to it. I know you have written many books, and that you have written books that talk about, sort of the principles. But this book is a little bit unique in that it's talking about your stories and your experiences. So I'm super excited to hear them. But let me start at the top. 100 cultures? Wow. Give me a sample of what that has looked like in your life.
Basically, it's kept me on a plane for most of the better part of the last 35 years, just getting on and off in various countries, many of which I've visited many times, a few of which I visited only once. But all in all, it's been over 100 different cultures. Yes, indeed.
Okay. So there are a few you would have missed, but not too many if I think about where global business happens today.
Well, that's the surprising thing. If you look at the map of the world and the political differences between the various countries, there are still more countries that I haven't visited than I actually have. But I go where my clients send me. And that means wherever most people are doing some sort of business. And in most cases, that's you can rank them. And it's interesting, too, that when I first started this work about 35 years ago, the countries and the cultures of most concern for U.S. American clients were, at that time, Japan and Germany. And of course, geopolitically, that's changed over the years. And so over the last 10 years, certainly the last 5 years, the emphasis has been on China and India and Brazil. And it'll be interesting to see over the next few years where the next interest will be. So I've traveled where the business has been. and it's changed as we've gone year by year.
All right, I'm going to ask you an unfair question, which, because it's unfair, you can bypass it, which is, what have been the most surprising cultures for you to work in?
Yeah, I would say there are two or two groups of cultures that have been the most surprising. The one that's been the most challenging for me, and this may simply be my own personal take, my own chemistry with this particular culture, but the one that has always been the most challenging for me was whenever I've had to work with Russian colleagues in Russia and dealing with Russian culture for a variety of different reasons. But equally, having said that, the cultures that often give me and my clients the most challenge are what we call cultures of similarity. Cultures that are so similar to, in this case, for the most part, US culture, that one doesn't expect to have very many differences. One doesn't expect to have very many challenges. But because of those similarities are greater than the differences are often overlooked, unacknowledged, and then they create problems. So working for US Americans with the UK, or working with helping my French colleagues work with their French-speaking colleagues in Asia. Similarities, but yet different.
It's interesting. I have not worked in as many cultures as you have, but I have sort of been around the globe in a variety of places. And sometimes I find Western European countries harder for everybody to get their heads around than the Asian cultures, which should be much more dissimilar, or the African cultures for that matter. And then, some things are surprises and some things are not surprises. How that culture really works is a continual puzzle. Okay, I want to ask the question, the sort of philosophical question of just how important culture really is. There's so much that's been homogenized. We watch the same movies, we look at YouTube channels, we have TikTok, we have news. I mean, everything is kind of global in ways. And yeah, there's backlash to that globalization. But do these differences really still matter?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I asked myself that question a lot of times, most recently in writing the book, because I have written books about cultural differences and how to manage those differences when working with people in other countries. That's been the bread and butter of our work for all these years. So does it really matter to write another book? And how much can we make it matter more than it already has? And I think that it really raises the issue that we all have to think hard about today, which is culture, when we talk about it, is even more important than it ever was because of this homogenization, because it looks as if we've all become more similar, that cultural differences really don't matter. But at the heart of it is that they matter even more now because they are masked. Globalization masks the differences that cultures provide or present. And because it's masked, we tend to think that it's no longer there. We get off a plane and we go wherever in the world we are. We're often doing business in environments that look and feel and smell and taste so similar to home. And yet fundamentally, the beliefs, the ideas, the way people have organized, the way that they do business, the way they run meetings, the way they value each other, the way they communicate with each other and negotiate with each other can all still be different based on the differences. So the world has become more complex. It doesn't mean that culture has become less important. And I think that's what we have to be very sensitive to.
I see a lot of managers assume that they can quickly understand their teams from a different culture, from a different country, that everybody is pretty much the same. They're motivated by the same. They care about the same output, efficiency, climbing the ladder, whatever else it is. And they go rushing along and then miss the connection with the human, miss the motivation, miss the inspiration, miss the trust, if you will, because there's an assumption, all right? So that assumption is true every human to every human. We make assumptions that it gets us in trouble, but it's particularly important to me in terms of culture, because I get surprised regularly by how I might normally say something and how a different culture will react to what I'm saying.
Precisely, because culture is invisible. It's almost unconscious. We are, and I think this is something that's really important for anybody who's working in another culture. We are cultural beings. We're not just what mom and dad created. We're not just the results of our DNA. We're not just the results of our experiences when we were 5 and 6 and 7, but all of this together creates a cultural being. And if you grow up in a particular formative culture, you become unaware of what this cultural being is when compared to another cultural being. And that's when we make assumptions about how people are supposed to behave. And we find out sometimes too far down the road that the behavior is going to be very different from someone from a different culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's dig in then for a minute. We could talk about this one philosophically for a long time. Number one lesson, when you pull back from all your 100+ experiences, what's the one thing you really wish people understood?
Oh boy. I think what I really wish them to understand is that the best thing you can do is approach your colleagues abroad with a sense of humility, and I would even say a sense of awe. In that their experience, their culture that created who they are, is an opportunity for you to see things differently, to think differently, and to behave differently in ways that might solve problems that you're facing, that you haven't been able to think about because those solutions are not part of your culture, but they may have developed from someone else's culture. So they are in front of you, they are present, and they are presenting a gift. If you can frame it like that, if you can begin to unpack it.
Yeah, and often waiting to be asked too. All right, I get from managers all the time when they've taken over a team and the team is in a different culture, where do I start? What do I ask? What's your advice? You said begin with awe and curiosity, humility. So what do I do? How do I understand this culture that I'm now working with?
Yeah, I think that you do have to take responsibility for understanding as much as you can, and the information is definitely out there. So if you're working with Saudi culture, there's a lot of info out there about how Saudis think, how they negotiate, how they run meetings, etc. And it is up to you and me to take responsibility for reading this stuff, for learning about it. If we have a Saudi colleague, to ask the questions about how they would do it, how things are done there, with humility and with true sincerity and interest. So we have to be responsible for getting this information, and technology certainly makes it easy for us to get this information. I can be self-serving and say, take a look at any of my books and read up on in this case, Saudi culture, right? But beyond that, then you have to understand that Ahmed, the individual that you may be speaking with in Riyadh, for example, Ahmed is today very much a Saudi still, and when he's in Saudi Arabia, he understands how to work in Saudi Arabia, and he can tell you everything you need to know about that. But it's very likely that he's also working with a global company that's got offices around the world, and he may have spent his summers at his father's flat in London. He may have his MBA from UCLA. So he is also a global person. He's got a global perspective. And I think that's what makes understanding culture complicated, more complicated today than it was in the past. That not only do we have to understand a particular culture, in this case, like Saudi, but we also have to understand that the people we're interacting with are global citizens. They are global workers, and it's very likely that they also understand other cultures as well, as you and I need to take responsibility for doing. So Ahmed knows exactly how to work in a Western environment, but he also knows how to work in a Saudi environment. And that's what complicates the picture.
I see that. I remember coaching a mid-career guy once who was in China and building, had quite a large team in China, building a big market, big portfolio for a Western headquartered company in China. And at that time in particular, there was an expectation of how he led his Chinese team that is very different than the expectation of the Western headquartered style of management. And I remember talking through him, like, you have to be able to code switch between these two. Yes, this is what your Chinese colleagues expect you to do, but if you do that in front of your company headquarters, senior stakeholders, they're not going to see that very favorably, nor are they going to understand why that's the expectation. So that switching, we often misunderstand when we're working with people who have exposure in multiple different cultures.
Yeah, it's been my experience that when you do work with, for example, Chinese colleagues, particularly, who are globalized and who do know how to code switch and change their behaviors, it often confuses Western managers because they're seeing one set of behaviors in one circumstance, then that person code switches, and then they behave very differently. And the Western interpretation of that is duplicity. Who can I trust? Which way is the correct way? What can I expect from this individual? And then it raises doubts and skepticism, and it creates a bigger problem than actually exists.
Yeah. Yes. I've seen that many, many, many times. All right. One more question before we dive into some of your stories. I often have said to people when they're trying to understand another culture that understanding the myths, so the tales that people grew up with, the local movie scripts, the stories that are popular, give you a nuanced sense of what it means to be a hero or a heroine in that culture. What's your reaction? Is that a good advice or bad advice?
I think it's terrific. Every culture has its myths, and the myths are telling. They give you insight into the values and the belief systems that drive the behaviors that you're going to see right across the negotiation table. And one of the exercises that my company has done very often in giving people this kind of insight is not only to take a look at myths, but to take a look at popular sayings or proverbs. And a proverb, for example, that I often have been mystified by the reaction of, or many of my clients have been, is the U.S. American proverb, God helps those who help blank. And when we ask our Chinese colleagues to fill in what they think is the missing word, the Chinese will say, God helps those who help others. And then we say, well, this is a U.S. American proverb and others is not the missing word. And when we tell them that the missing word is God helps those who help themselves, their perception and insight into U.S. American culture changes dramatically. And just as if we were to tell this story to U.S. Americans about the Chinese orientation toward otherness and group and face and how you appear to others being primary rather than how you appear and solve your own problems to yourself. And just having the conversation around the difference in this proverb and the interpretation of the proverb is often very, very insightful.
We could take a deep dive on that one. I was just in Japan this summer, and I have a long-standing, decade-long fascination with Japan, which is a very community-oriented culture. So there is much more emphasis on the individual, as you know, than on the community than on the individual. But the way that shows up in modern Japan is kind of astounding. And as an American, it's such an antithesis for what I grew up with. It's kind of a shock to see
it's 180 degrees difference.
And to see the pros and cons of that. All right, let's dig into your stories. Enough of my pontificating. There are a couple of things that you talk about in each of your chapters that I find fascinating. And one of those is about expertise. and the role of expertise, credibility, authority in different cultures. So tell me about your experience. Tell me a story and tell me about your understanding of how this notion of expertise shows up.
Yeah, I think of India, for example, and much of the work that I've done with Western teams in India, Western companies working in India. There's a theme that constantly keeps coming up, which revolves around this idea of expertise. The manager is expected in Indian culture, for a variety of different reasons, to have expertise or knowledge about a particular task, an issue, whatever the problem might be. And that is to be unquestioned by the team. So the expectation of the Indian team of a manager is someone who will tell them what they need to know based on their expertise, their experience, or their skill. And you don't question it. You don't ask why. And if things don't work out, you don't tell the manager, because that would imply that you're questioning their expertise and making them look like they don't have the expertise that you expect them to have. The American management style often is to default decision-making to the team and allow the team to come up with the solutions to questions and problems, and that if they need help, they'll turn to their manager and ask the manager or make suggestions even as to what needs to be done. When U.S. managers come to their Indian team without an understanding of the expected behavior, they often make the mistake of basically saying, well, here's the problem. You guys solve it. That's your job. And if you need anything, come to me, and I'll try to figure it out for you. And from the Indian perspective, this is anathema. You can't not be told what your manager wants. It's the manager's job to tell you what they want. And it's not your job to ask the manager for things that they should know that you need, nor is it your job to tell them or make suggestions about what they should be doing different from the way that they tell you to do things. And so it's a complete breakdown in communications. And I've seen this over and over again. U.S. managers going over to India, thinking, how are things going with the project, getting all sorts of answers like everything is fine, when it turns out that nothing is happening and there are serious problems. But the manager isn't hearing about it because the team is not telling them. That would be disrespectful. It would be challenging their expertise.
So if you're a manager working with an Indian team, let's be concrete. You're an engineer working with engineers in India, a common scenario I see, and you're trying to drive forward a project and you want your Indian team to take accountability and drive that forward. What's your path forward? How do you make that work?
Well, what you have to do is build a trusting relationship first with a key individual who you know is going to tell you what's really going on. Because once you step back on the plane and go back to Milwaukee, you're not going to get all the information that you need as to what's really happening there. If you can't make that kind of trusting work relationship where a key individual will tell you what's really happening, then you have to build working relationships with several different individuals so that you get all the information. Because if you ask one person, they might say everything is fine. If you ask a second person, they might say everything is fine, but we had a little problem with this. And if you ask a third person, they might say everything is fine, but we had a little problem with that. And when in truth, what they're all telling you is that we have a major catastrophe, but no one is giving you the full story. So you really have to have multiple sources of information that you can count on.
Right. And this says, the sort of Western notion of empowering your team needs reconfiguration when I'm working with a culture like India, that takes a different format than we teach in the West. Is that true?
Yes, it does. It's not that Indians won't do what needs to be done, and it's not that they will do things differently from what you say. Eventually they will. It's that the communication around this won't be as you expect it to be. And therefore, there'll be all sorts of misjudgments when you find out, in fact, that things are being done differently from the way you expect them to be done.
All right, let's talk about then a related concept. So, expertise, different cultures value expertise and respect expertise in different ways. What about this notion of initiative? And by that, I mean that sort of willing to step in and drive for results.
Yeah.
It's kind of related. How does this happen around the world?
Well, yeah, you'll see it, and I certainly have seen it over and over again, in the difference between what we call individualist cultures, such as the United States, where individualism and behaviors related to demonstrating individual initiative are valued. So we even have words for it, right? Step up to the plate, don't sweep it under the rug, say what needs to be said, and take initiative and take responsibility for it and accountability for it. And all of that is theoretically and practically, more often than not, valued in a U.S. environment, U.S. work environment. But when you go to other cultures that are not individualistic in their orientation, such as what I would refer to as collectivist type cultures, cultures where one doesn't demonstrate individual initiative and one doesn't take responsibility for standing out, but rather steps back because of various other cultural reasons where it's that kind of behavior is not looked upon as positive. Then you're going to have individuals who are not forthcoming and who are not stepping up to the plate. And in their culture, they're doing exactly what needs to be done. They're doing it precisely the right way. And yet that kind of behavior is often misunderstood. I think of Japan, for example, where we have the saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, where we're saying and behaving as if you are the reason why things will get done, independent of what others think and do, is probably the worst thing that you can do. And so people behave in such a way where no individual behaviors are protected and are hidden. And so it's hard to identify individuals for either responsibility or accountability. Rather, the entire team takes accountability or responsibility for something. So how do you get individuals to step up to the plate? Well, one of the things you do is you don't expect that to happen, and you empower teams, not individuals. You reward teams, not individuals. You don't critique individuals, and you don't reward them publicly. You critique and reward privately, and when it comes to individuals, and you reward and critique teams for their team performance. So it raises all sorts of issues around face and honor, and singling individuals out for their individual behavior is, in the U.S., honest, sometimes appropriate, sometimes worthy, and the appropriate result of a good effort. And in a place like Japan, that would signal death. It would destroy the functions of the team, and the team is everything.
That is so, I find this individual collectivist dimension one of the hardest ones to get my head around, because I am so personally deeply steeped in a very individual culture. As much as I value the collectivism, it's all over the culture in which I spend much of my time. And so this notion of the individual doesn't solve their problems on their own, the individual doesn't take accountability on their own, the individual doesn't show initiative on their own, it's all a collective act, is just bizarre to me. And I think I'm not alone on that one.
And I can assume, Wanda, that it also shines lights for you, and also holds lots of lessons, that there are moments where it's remarkable to see the functionality of a team in a place like Japan. And you can almost sit back in awe of it because it is the way things are done. But it is so time consuming, it is so energy consuming, and one must be very, very careful about how one speaks about individuals, how it causes loss of face or makes face for individuals, and how it can make or break the function of a team, which is absolutely the only way things get done in Japan.
Okay, it is very interesting. It's the reason I'm fascinated with Japan. There are other cultures that are also collectivist, but Japan is the one I've highlighted on because there are some beauties of that collectivist approach if you stop to look with awe and a little bit of humility. Like, there's a lot to be said. Low crime rate being one of them.
Absolutely. Or
it's really fascinating.
Or one of during COVID, I believe, because wearing a mask was absolutely part of the DNA of the culture in Japan, very much prior to COVID. If you had a cold, you put a mask on so that you wouldn't give your cold to others. It was the respect that the individual and the individual situation had for others. So when it became time for everyone to wear a mask, it was absolutely simple to do. We just all do it.
Yeah, and in contrast, in the U.S., prior to COVID, the U.S. predominantly believed that you wore a mask because you were protecting yourself from somebody else. And that captures the entire conundrum. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So we've talked about expertise, differences in expertise. We've talked about this notion of initiative or taking control, individualistic practices versus more collective practices. Let's talk about time. Like this notion that, again, in the West, most Western cultures, I put more effort in, I put in more time, I'm showing my dedication and loyalty and yada, 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 yada. But not every culture sees time in the same way.
Yeah, exactly true. And this dimension trips a lot of U.S. Americans up because in our culture, we conflate the idea of effectiveness with efficiency. Efficiency is the primary value, and if you're efficient, and the more efficient you can be with time and resources, the more effective you will be. That formula works in the US. But conflating efficiency and effectiveness in cultures where time and time management is not the primary value, where instead the primary value may be elsewhere. It may be in how do I become effective? Maybe I'm effective in not worrying about time management so much, but worrying about or putting my energy and resources in building relationships that I can rely on. I have seen, for example, in cultures that do not emphasize time management, but rather emphasize relationship management, that a good deal of time is spent on building the relationship. And at the end of the day, we can get lots of things done very quickly once we have the relationship in place. But in the US, for example, where it's about being as efficient as possible, and therefore that proves the value of having the relationship. It's the other way around. Then we're rewarded often for being very efficient, but at the end of the day, we still may not be effective.
Well, it drives for transactional.
It's transactional versus relationship.
That's right. If I'm really pushing for efficiency, so results, individual results in particular, at the expense of others, then I'm going to say, is another minute with you worth it in my time or not? Okay? I'm not going to be thinking about the relationship I'm building and what that might potentially give me in the long run. I'm going to be thinking about getting this moment to its maximum value. And you will make a different trade-off in how I spend that next moment. Makes sense to me.
Right. Yeah. I've seen over and over again in what one might call a less time-conscious cultures, more relationship cultures, this idea that we do have to put in a lot of time up front building a relationship, which is often seen as a waste of time in a U.S. cultural environment because we don't have to build this kind of relationship up front. Let's just get the job done. That will prove the value of the relationship later on. And in many places, I think this represents a historical legacy of needing to have close, trusting personal relationships in order to get anything done, which has been the experience of many other cultures, as opposed to the privilege, I think, that the U.S. has had for most of its history, which is that we can depend upon rules and processes and procedures that we can rely on so that we don't have to build this kind of personal trust to get things done.
It will be interesting to see how that continues in decades to come.
I'm not so sure.
Give me an example of a relationship-oriented culture and what that looks like on the ground in that culture.
Yeah, I think of many of the Latin American cultures, and I'm thinking right now of Mexico. Now, it doesn't mean that every Mexican colleague you're going to be interacting with is, because Mexicans, have, like Ahmed being familiar with Western culture, many Mexicans are familiar with U.S. American culture. So the individuals can vary on this scale, but in general, Mexican culture is a relationship-oriented culture. And traditionally, in order to get anything done, I needed to be able to trust you. I needed to know who you are. We needed to build a chemistry and a trusting working relationship. And in order to ensure that, we had to get to know each other first. And that meant spending time over at dinner, sharing drinks together, being tested in situations that wouldn't have a great consequence, but your behavior is tested to see if you will behave in an honest and trustworthy way around a small issue that would then therefore justify doing business with you on the real larger issue. We see this kind of testing is often done in places like China as well, where it's what you have to do first to see if you have a trusted working relationship with an individual. In China, this kind of relationship building is referred to as building guanxi, building a trusting, obligatory relationship where I take care of you and you take care of me. And until that's in place, nothing real or consequential will happen. In Mexico, similarly, traditionally one had to establish one's credibility and trustworthiness before anything would happen. And I've worked with U.S. American clients who have spent hours in Mexico, days trying to get a transaction to happen, while apparently to them it was more important that their Mexican colleagues meet with them over dinner, get to know each other, share drinks, share personalities, share families, and before anything consequential would happen in business. And to the American, that looks like a waste of time. And to the Mexican, it's absolutely essential.
It's necessary. I understand Mexican culture less well than I think I understand Chinese culture, which is an interesting statement for me. But I understand this notion of guanxi, that until I know I have a relationship with you and with your extended network in some ways, I don't know that I can count on you to actually follow through on what you said. So in some ways, you're describing Mexico as being the same in that I need to know I can trust you. So now you said, and I'm going to get to know you in that one. You said people would be tested. Give me an example of a kind of test from Mexico.
Yeah, for Mexico specifically, you might be asked to perform and I'm thinking about a particular client right now, where you might be asked to perform a particular task and do it in a certain way, following the processes of the procedural handbook, right? And to what degree would you vary that from that? And how quickly can that be done? And how much of what you're doing is going to help me look good in the eyes of my manager? And If you can perform this task which doesn't have any major consequence, then we can really sit down and trust each other and go further. Right.
I can think about things that I've done in Mexico and say, oh yeah, I see that. All right, let's talk about trust in general, because I believe how trust is established varies around countries. What's your experience in what creates trust?
Well, I think it requires that you demonstrate that you are on their side. The challenge, I think, for the Western manager in many of these other cultures is that they don't know what's going to look like they're on their side through the eyes of the person that they're trying to do business with. In some cultures, that means taking care of my eldest son who's looking to get into a U.S. medical school. It could take the form of whether or not you'll cooperate with the need for a bribe. And this can become serious challenges. I mean, you can't do what's illegal, and you mustn't do what's illegal. But what's illegal in the U.S. may not be illegal in this other culture. So how we build this trust is going to have to be different culture by culture. But building it is essential, I think, ultimately at the end of the day in all cultures. But certainly it is the priority focus for many cultures. And it's simply not the priority focus of the U.S.
Well, I think trust is a priority focus in the U.S., but it takes a particular definition. So what fascinates me about trust is that we define it in very different ways. We always use the same words, but what I look at in your behavior to say I trust you can be very different person to person as well as culture to culture. So in the U.S., I think we trust experience far more than we trust relationship. So you've been there, you've done that before, you know what you're talking about. We over-index on that, I think, in the U.S. I think there's more to it than that, but that is part of it. And sometimes I think we over-index on commonality. Like we like the same sports teams. So, okay, we must be good, must be safe to trust you. I'm trivializing. But in other places, it's a much different formula than just the expertise or the common ground.
Yes, in other places it might be, can I count on you to protect me? And to what degree will you do so, even if it starts to compromise your values or your truthfulness, your objectivity? Are you on my team, and to what degree will you go to stay on my team? And in some cultures, that will present challenges to U.S. Americans.
Yes, I can see that one as well. Okay, what have we not talked about that you think people should know?
Well, I think what we haven't talked. Well, I think I've alluded to it in that we're in a world today different from the world that I started doing this work in 35 years ago, which was at the time U.S. Americans getting out there into the rest of the world. We were in the process of globalizing as a feature of international business. But today, we're in a globalized world, and therefore it's far more complicated. The complication does not mean, however, that culture has become less important. In fact, it's become more important because it's still fundamental to everyone's behavior wherever they are. And I think keeping this in mind is difficult when everything kind of looks and smells and tastes the same, no matter where you are. At the end of the day, deep down inside, cultures change very slowly, and it may superficially look as if a culture has changed dramatically in your favor, meaning more familiar to you. But at the end of the day, it's still what it was 2,500 years ago in many, many ways. And I'll use China as an example on this. I remember the first time I started doing work in China, going back into the 80s, standing on the corner of the river in Shanghai, looking across the river to what is known as Pudong, And at the time, it was a sleepy fishing village. There were a few lights, and that's all there was. And just 35 years later, Pudong is the iconic symbol of modern China today. Certainly, at this superficial visual level, if one were to make decisions about what this means about Chinese behavior, you could say, oh, it looks just like the West. It's all neon lit, and it's big skyscrapers, and it's lots of air-conditioned office towers, and people are even speaking English. At the time when I was first there back in the 80s, no one spoke English. So you could misjudge what that means. And you could say, well, Chinese culture's changed a great deal. Superficially, yes. But Chinese values still drive Chinese behaviors. And Chinese values, created over 5,000 years of history, do not change quickly and are fundamental to the ultimate behavior that you're going to experience sitting across the table in that conference room. And that's the complicated mix of managing culture today.
Right. And with that anybody that you are working with probably has an experience of the culture from which you come as well, because they're all going to likely to be globalized in some ways, and they have their own expectations of what you will and will not to do. And so we have a nice, interesting mix of both. It looks the same, and it is also very different on both sides.
Yeah, and we have the possibility of really misunderstanding each other, because if I don't understand that 5,000-year history of Chinese traditions, and if the Chinese colleague that I'm working with doesn't understand what American values and traditions really are, then we're going to have all sorts of missed expectations and misinterpretations of the behaviors that we're seeing with each other.
Dean, I think as I look back on this conversation, I think it's an understanding of what each of us holds dear to ourselves, our values, our drivers, our expectations, how we behave, what we hold ourselves accountable for, that are often steeped in our own history and our own culture. That understanding that and not making the assumption that everybody around the world is steeped in the same set is number one.
Number one.
Okay, and number two, this conversation reminds me again that particularly in a world with so much uncertainty, unknown, change going on, at the end of the day, relationships matter more than ever. So taking the time to build those relationships, whatever that looks like in the culture in which you're collaborating, probably is worthwhile for you and for the other counterpart.
Right. I think that's an absolute, that's a good truth to hold on to. And it's particularly when times become uncertain, as they are in many ways more uncertain now than I can recall over the last decade or so. The relationships will be the cement that will hold things in place and carry us through. Right.
That's right. All right. My guest today, Dean Foster. The book we're talking about is Business Beyond Borders: Stories, Tales, and Lessons Learned from Working in 100 Countries Around the World. Dean, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way to find you?
Come to my website. That would be deanfosterglobal.com. And all sorts of information about all my books is there. Lots of stories and excerpts from the stories are available. My articles, and the history of the work that I do. Okay. It's all there.
All right. Now, it's only carefully that I'm recommending somebody check out another podcast, but you might also want to check out Dean's podcast, Oops, Your Culture's Showing.
We have Dean, a lot of fun with the podcast and
I
talk
can
about
imagine, yes,
culture in a lighthearted way.
It's a great idea. Dean, thanks for joining us. What a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Wanda, a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And to everybody listening, join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone. If you want to watch this episode as opposed to just listen to it, go to our YouTube channel at Out of the Comfort Pod. And always send us a comment. We love to hear from you. What are you thinking? What are you reacting to? What are your questions? And we'll get back to you sometime before long. Take care. See you next week.